Everybody for coming today to our first session of the workshops on social analysis of penalities across boundaries that we have been organizing for quite a long time now, every month, every last Wednesday of each month, and are organized by the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research and the Crime and Society program from the National University of Litoral in Argentina. So we have today the privilege of having with us to present and share his thoughts that are contained in his last book, David Garland from the University of New York. As you all know, he has published this new book, Law and Order Leviathan, America's Extraordinary Regime of Policing and Punishment. So as usual, we will have something like a talk of 30 minutes or around 30 minutes by David, and then we will start the Q&A. So thank you again, David, for agreeing to participate in this session. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Maximo. Thank you, Richard. Thanks to everyone who's here. I see many old friends and faces on my screen. So the book, Law and Order Leviathan, is out here in the USA for about a month now. It's not published, I think, until October the 14th in the UK. I don't know about elsewhere. It's very short, happily. It's 136 pages, about 30 pages of notes. Mostly it's short because I relegate discussion of the literature to the notes, and the text is kind of straightforwardly addressed to a kind of a broad audience rather than simply my scholarly colleagues, you. I'm going to try and summarize the book simply by going through it chapter by chapter just now, so reducing what's already short to an even shorter 30 minutes. To say a little bit about its framing or its motivation, basically the book has two motivating questions. One is a question about a scholarly issue. Why is American penal state, why is the American penal state such an outlier by comparison to other developed high-income countries? Why do US states and jurisdictions utilize policing aggressively and penal power more extensively than do any of the comparative countries? And why do African Americans bear the brunt of these repressive forces? That's a question I've been working on for some time. I've written some of that before. Some of you will know this work. The other question is a more political one and a more temporal one. Basically, the movements, the kind of radical critique and the radical mobilization against American policing and the penal state that occurred in the summer of 2020, I think put some questions on the agenda about root causes. Is it the case that the American penal state is the expression of racial capitalism, white supremacy, ultra-liberalism? Can nothing be done about the American penal state unless and until these structures are removed? The question of abolition or the ambition of abolition, these seem to me to be issues which kind of emerged, were made mainstream for a moment, then have kind of settled back into kind of activist world, but also the academic world. I mean, it's amazing the extent to which a law school like this one, where I'm talking from, so many of the students now, so many of the young faculty now are motivated by abolitionist questions. So I wanted to address these issues and talk about them. What the book does primarily is it tries to explain the extraordinary levels of American violence and the extraordinary character of American policing and punishment by reference to structural processes of political economy. It describes that political economy and then tries to explain and identify the processes whereby these structures, these pressures of a political and economic kind are brought to bear upon neighborhoods and communities and families and give rise, as it were, through that intermediate process to criminogenic outcomes, levels of violence that we haven't seen in other high-income countries, and to a form of state response, which has been primarily aggressive policing and punishment. That structural story that I tell is very much an indirect one. One of the major features of the book, I think, are the central chapters where I talk about the intermediating processes which I think of as being community level forms of action, which are to do with community organization and levels of social efficacy and informal social control, and levels of local police response and punishment response. And these indirect processes mean that the same macrostructural forces give rise to very different levels of criminal violence in the first place, to criminogenic processes, and to penal rates and policing forms. Nevertheless, the larger point is that the American nation as a whole, all 50 states, all thousands of local jurisdictions, are all of them off to one side when compared with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, and so on. In other words, America has much variation within its continental landmass, but all of that variation is within a kind of range, a bandwidth, which makes it an outlier when compared to other developed nations. So the story is a political economy story about labor markets and about the welfare state and their impact on communities and families, violence, and then state response to these. Running alongside the political economy story, and political economy is always in this country already racialized. It's already structured in ways that disadvantage Black Americans in particular. But running alongside that is a story about levels of violence and the pervasiveness of guns in the USA. And these violence levels, and particularly the presence of guns, amplify and magnify and exacerbate what are otherwise sociological processes leading to disorder and violence. And one of the I think one of the parts of the book that I found most challenging, and I think in the end is most original, is a historical account that I give of the emergence of a gun culture, the emergence of the pervasive presence of guns in the US, and the legal permissiveness that accompanies that phenomenon. I try and show how violence and eventually guns are wrapped up with the American process of state formation and state development. And I tell a story about the not just the kind of early Republican ideas about an armed militia and an armed population, but the way in which the Civil War led to the training and the arming of most of the adult population in the country, and how after the Civil War these forces were demobilized and for the most part were not disarmed as they returned home. And then to this trained armed population was introduced a gun manufacturing industry in the USA, which made cheap, reliable small arms available and kind of advertised them as part of the American legacy and the American heritage and what it is to be an American. There's a gun control story that I tell, a gun provision story that I tell there, which is tied up with how America became its modern self. The book, therefore, is focused on the USA, tries to explain the American case, but I think it offers or develops a theory of the relationship between political economy and policing and punishment. In principle, at least, that theory should be applicable to other jurisdictions. And indeed, if one were to develop the work, then you begin to apply it within the USA to state by state variation or regional variation, in the same way you would want to apply it to other countries, and see whether the kind of the processes and the mechanism I'm describing help explain relationships and outcomes there as well. The book ends with my reflecting on the political implications of the theory I outline, talking about the way in which, if this is a structural story, but one that's indirect and not deterministic, then what prospect is there for change within the USA in its policing and violence and punishment and so on? So I end up addressing the question of abolition and root cause analysis there. Okay, so that's the overview of the book. Let me rapidly go through the different chapters and give you a sense of what's contained there. And as I do, I hope some sense of the texture of the argument. And then I'll stop at 11:30, just after 11:30 or 4:30, wherever you are. Halfway through, I'll stop, and then we can have Q&A at that point. So the prologue of the book is called From Tocqueville to Hobbes. And what I'm doing there is suggesting that people often think of the USA as a liberal nation. They often think of the USA as a kind of place described by Alexis de Tocqueville, a kind of liberal civil society, self-governing, concerned with the minimization of the state and the maximization of individual freedoms and people's flourishing and dignity and so on. What I suggest is that that's a story that Americans tell themselves, but by and large, the liberalism that governs in the USA, particularly since the collapse of the New Deal in the 1970s, has been a market liberalism, has been a kind of ultra-liberal market fundamentalism, and that by and large, the concern for every individual, if that individual is poor, that individual is black, that individual is justice involved, is sorely lacking. It's not a liberal society that concerns itself with the dignity of everyone. It's also the case that the state in the USA, particularly its policing and punishment aspect these days, also, of course, its immigration control, looks to me much less like a Tocquevillian story and much more like a Hobbesian one. In other words, Hobbes famously in Leviathan uses the term that's taken from the book of Job in the Bible to describe a sea monster, uses that term Leviathan to describe a state which is authoritarian and kind of monstrous. He says that there's no power on earth compares to it. And that monstrous state is created by a population, by a populace that's insecure and fearful of violence and decides to contract with itself and to establish a form of authoritarian government in order to provide protection, security, and peace. And my notion of the American penal state as being a Leviathan is, first of all, it's clearly monstrous in the sense of being extraordinarily large and capacious compared to every other penal state elsewhere. It's also, in some sense, importantly, I think, a response to violence and insecurity. I mean, the politics of law and order and the buildup of law and order legislation in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is, I think, triggered by, although not fully explained by, the astonishing levels of homicide and armed robbery that were a feature of the nation and are still a feature of the nation, even though they've been reduced considerably since then. And thirdly, that the idea that actually the Leviathan is authorized by the people. I mean, basically, we've had law and order politics for a couple of decades in which electorates at every level of American government, at the federal level, in federal elections, state level, city level elections, time and time again, majorities have voted for policies and politicians that held out an aggressive penal state as the solution to insecurity. So the Leviathan is the name I give to the American penal state, and it kind of, I hope, captures some sense of its features and its connection to the American political process. The first chapter is called Challenging Leviathan, and there I talk a little bit about, it's a very short chapter, I talk about the events of summer 2020, how during the plague year, during the period of time when people were at home, not working, not in school, the murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed by Black Lives Matter brought out and onto the streets and eventually into the newspapers and into mainstream conversations for a moment. It didn't really last much longer than a few months. A kind of fundamental critique of American policing and punishment, mass incarceration, racial criminal justice, the killing of civilians by the police, massive stop and search. All of these things were challenged and questioned and criticized. And the whole idea of defunding or abolishing these institutions was discussed. That was a conversation that previously had taken place on the activist fringes in local politics by abolitionist. Suddenly it became something that the newspapers were discussing, that editorials were considering, that politicians were signing on to. Most of them now deeply regret having done so, but that was a moment. Not very long afterwards, America is, by the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, is returning to a kind of law and order, business as usual. That's true in the city where I live. The election of Eric Adams was primarily about he's the only Democratic candidate who's not for defunding the police. Did you notice that homicide levels are ticking up during the pandemic? Maybe that's a problem. Maybe we should have a police force. Maybe we should have a police force that we fund and we authorize. So that's the Eric Adams story. It's the same story when progressive prosecutors across the country were deselected, or of course, eventually when Donald Trump is re-elected in the federal elections. That this is the law and order candidacy. What happens is very quickly America kind of returns to its standard uh, orientation, which is a conservative concern about law and order. So this was a moment. It was also, by the way, a moment when um, the America kind of invented a pop-up European style welfare state. I mean, there was a while in 2021 when suddenly unemployment benefits and stimulus checks were being sent to every household, where the rent moratoriums where people had the rent frozen, didn't have to pay it. People were, funded. Healthcare was extended. There was a whole series of remarkable extensions of what had previously been a minimal welfare state for the poor. That too quickly came to an end as soon as the crisis was over. So America kind of regressed to its mean or returned to form. But I think that the questions that the radical movement put on the agenda about how to explain American policing violence, how to think about mass incarceration, what it would take to reform these institutions, I think these are questions that will linger and continue. And the younger generation of voters, the Democratic base, uh, academics, young academics particularly, now there's a kind of new horizon for thinking about these questions that I think simply wasn't there before. So I wanted to write this book um, in response to these questions and to kind of figure out how to think about them, not in a kind of in the kind of passion of the moment when people say to themselves, my God, there's nothing you can do to reform the system, we have to bring it down, but rather a more kind of realistic, pragmatic, Weberian sense of what are the possibilities for change and how should we think about it. Chapter 2 is an outline of the theory, basically. Chapter 2 is called Towards a Structural Explanation, and I give a statement of the theoretical framework for the book. So basically, I talk about I talk about what American political development, political economy, and race look like. Then I talk about some key theoretical concepts. First of all, what I think of as the sources of social order. And there the emphasis is on not police and punishment, but on informal mechanisms of socialization, social control, social integration, and what happens when these mechanisms are disturbed and undermined and not supported by a political economy? What happens to families and communities when their capacity for social control is undermined by these economic forces? I talk about penal controls and social controls, the kind of symbiotic relationship between policing and punishment on the one hand, and families and communities and workplaces and schools on the other, and how in the USA, particularly in poorer communities, particularly in communities of color, how the difficulties experienced by communities and families in exerting social control informally tend to give rise to criminogenic processes and eventually to policing and punishment. I talk about the concept of the American bandwidth. I've kind of mentioned that a moment ago. I'll say it again. Basically, the claim is that compared to the developed nations and the OECD countries, but particularly America, and particularly Canada, New Zealand, Australia, uh, Western Europe, and Northern Europe, compared to all of these countries, the US penal state is an outlier on virtually every dimension. However, there's variation within that US penal state. The US penal state isn't a thing. There are 50 states. There are, thousands of local jurisdictions and prosecution offices and police departments and so on. Within that state, there's variation. Even the most, I don't know what the right word is, even the least repressive of these, whether it's, Minnesota or Maine or New Hampshire, New England, they still are off to one side from the most repressive of the European and Canadian and Australian jurisdictions, but within the USA, there's lots of variation. So I think about this as a structurally distinct set of institutions, but one which is varied and which is subject to change over time. I talk about intermediating processes. Here, what I'm thinking about is pretty simple. Basically, I want to insist that while the macro structures of American political economy, the labor market, the welfare state, housing support, federal intervention, they impact neighborhoods in, a relatively uniform way across the American landmass, that the capacity of individual communities, individual neighborhoods to respond to these external pressures varies. And it varies even when the same socioeconomic conditions exist. In other words, we know from urban sociology that neighborhoods have a structure of their own that is durable, and their capacity to exert collective efficacy, their capacity to command resources to resist and be resilient in the face of pressures is a variable. And therefore, we would expect that the intermediating community level processes would make a difference to the impact of the political economy, and would mean that in some places criminogenic processes were more liable to take root and produce disorder, to produce crime, to produce violence. And in other places, there was more likely to be community level responses and resilience and resistance and organization and effective policing or effective prevention. So the story I'm telling there is one about material conditions and social controls, with the emphasis on relatively autonomous intermediate community level processes. The third chapter, having outlined the theory, sets out in detail a comparative account of the American penal state. And basically what I show is in terms of policing, levels of police killings of civilians, or levels of stop and search, or levels of aggressiveness, in terms of prosecution, sentencing, incarceration, supervision, collateral consequences, fees and fines and charges imposed. In all of these respects, with each of these aspects of the criminal legal process, the USA is an outlier. And I just show this in a way that's kind of documented and clear, and I hope might be quite useful for teaching purposes. Say, it brings together a lot of material and presents it in a simple, straightforward way. The follow-up chapter talks about the nature of that penal state. And I make an argument there that I've made before, which is that running through each of these institutions, each of these sets of practices, despite all their variation and their different functions and so on, there's an imperative of control that, policing and punishment, sentencing, prisons, parole, probation, they've all got lots of purposes, lots of meanings, lots of functions. But in the USA, the primary one, the imperative one, is the imposition of penal control. We can have cheap and mean measures, we can have vengeful measures, we can have measures that are to do with humiliation, we can have measures that are to do with reducing tax costs. They only ever are implemented to the extent that they enable penal control. That's the claim. Why is that? Well, it's because of the perceived and actual limitations of social control that I just described. The sense that law and order politics connects with, the thinking of police departments, the thinking of sentencers and parole boards and so on, probation officers, is that frequently one is dealing with a disorderly, disorganized, dangerous, and gun-laden social setting in which individuals who've been identified as being engaged in criminal behavior live and behave, and the social background that the material conditions of that social background, I think, emphasize to decision makers and to the politicians and the public that support and authorize them the sense that these are people that need to be controlled. These are people who are a danger to public safety, and maybe they're not, but why should we take a risk? So the emphasis on penal control for reasons that have to do with the social background that I already described in the outline. The next chapter is an account of American political economy. And here I describe how the labor market in the USA provides conditions for working people that are more insecure, more stable, and more pressurized, more unstable and more pressurized than any comparable developed nations. And I document this piece by piece in terms of workers' protections, employment protections, hiring at will, the lack of parental leave, the lack of health care, lack of housing support. All of these features of the labor market, I got beyond the labor market with housing support, but all of these features of the labor market combined with a welfare state, which in the USA is a very complex apparatus. Much of it's to do with support for people who've been in employment. Some of it's to do with, tax code exemptions and refunds and allowances for rich people. So the welfare state's a big thing. But welfare for the poor, that's to say welfare for income support for people who are needy, is decidedly restrictive and conditional and mean and limited. And so too are the public goods, healthcare, housing, education even, income support and employment support. As compared to other countries, the US welfare state does not provide these social supports for poor people to anything like the same extent. And if you're an able-bodied male working age person, it provides pretty much no support. So the claim is that America's welfare state is liable to give rise to these outcomes. And all of that got worse for poor people after the collapse of the New Deal and with the introduction of neoliberal politics. That chapter 2 has a discussion about violence and the development of violence on the frontier, in slavery and Jim Crow, in the way that businesses were allowed to deal with the labor movement by crushing it using private police and violence and sometimes state militias and federal forces, violence against protesters, and of course all of that exacerbated and multiplied by the presence of guns for the reasons that I've described in the book. The middle two chapters of the book are what I think of the crucial two chapters of the book are about how political economy impacts neighborhoods and how political economy and institutions impact crime control. And I've kind of indicated already what's in these chapters. So an analysis of the intermediate processes and criminogenic outcomes. And also in the chapter about crime control, an emphasis on how the US state allocates to local jurisdictions responsibility for and the need to finance policing and local punishment, local courts, jails, meaning that these neighborhoods and these places that have the most problems have the least resources to deal with them. Meaning that if the American state were to decide to provide, to respond to crime and disorder by, I don't know, social policy or economic intervention or provision for the poor, the responsible unit of government could not do it by itself. It would require state and federal provision and intervention, which since the 1960s has been decidedly absent. So there's a state capacity problem and a political design problem. And there's also, I emphasize in that chapter, the material conditions that set the USA apart. When people, police or prosecutors or sentencers think about who they're dealing with, they think about disorganized neighborhoods and guns and danger and violence, and they act accordingly. I'm at the end of my time. I want to just say very briefly that the penultimate chapter talks about how is it that Americans could, for so long, tolerate this and indeed authorize and vote for this monstrous penal state. And that's a story about social distance and segregation and racial divisions and the failure to build solidaristic institutions that go across class and across racial groups. And I connect there with kind of the notion of universalistic welfare states and how that's not what the USA has. And then the final chapter is basically an epilogue where I talk about how this structural analysis confirms what the radical 2020 Black Lives Matter movements were saying, namely that there's a root cause explanation of the American penal state, and it has to do with American capitalism and American racial capitalism, or the racialized nature of the American political economy, to put it a way I'd rather prefer. However, structural explanation doesn't mean that only structural change can have any effect. In other words, macro structures and micro level action are not connected in some deterministic lockstep way, that the emphasis on intermediate processes is intended to explain that. Within the American bandwidth, I show that not only could there be changes in policing and punishment, and indeed in levels of violence, that would be not just significant, but quite radical in terms of the number of people that are affected and the difference it would make to their lives. You could make these changes without any structural change in the American political economy. How do I know that? Because it's been happening in various states over time in ways that we can point to. So, for example, reductions in the homicide levels markedly from 1994 to 2014, changes in levels of incarceration in places like New York City or New York State, reductions in juvenile detention across the whole nation, changes in the use of solitary confinement or disenfranchisement. There's a whole bunch of changes that occur within the US bandwidth, which have been happening without a shift towards social democracy. So there's no reason to despair, is what I'm arguing. At the same time, and this I'm sure will get me in trouble with some of my colleagues and some of my students, the argument about abolitionism, if by that one means institutional abolition, abolition of the police, abolition of punishment, I show to be sociologically naive or ill-informed or impossible. I mean, basically, there's no modern society without an armed enforcement agency that undertakes to make the law compulsory rather than simply optional. And the prison exists for reasons that are that have to do with our sensibilities regarding, say, physical violence and corporal and capital punishment or banishment. I mean, short of these measures, any penal system requires a coercive measure with which people don't have to comply. If you think of most of the penal sanctions, fines, probation, supervision, community service, all of them require the cooperation of the individual concerned. That individual offender needs to show up and pay the money or be supervised. You don't have to think about Hannibal Lecter to explain why we have prisons. Just think about the non-compliant offender, right? And the prison is modern society's answer to constraint in such circumstances. Obviously, we could and should have prisons that are used much less frequently, are much better regulated, much better regimes, used in ways that are minimalist rather than maximalist. All sorts of things that could improve America's prison, just like all sorts of things that can improve America's policing. But the abolition of these institutions is not on the table. End of sermon.
Thank you very much, David. Many thanks for your presentation.